Today, we are taking on what might be the most ambitious and frankly painful topic imaginable, a deep dive into the chronological journey of the Second World War.
It really is.
hmm
The sources consistently describe it as the cruelest, the most destructive conflict the world has ever known. And, a single narrative just doesn't capture the sheer complexity. It wasn't really one war, was it?
No, it was more like an amalgamation, a tangle of conflicts, and critically, as the sources point out, woven through almost every single front was this international civil war between the political left and the right.
Exactly. A battle of ideologies playing out amidst the national conflicts.
So our mission today, and look, we know this is a massive undertaking, is to give you a structured chronological shortcut through it all. We're pulling out the key events, the facts, the sometimes startling anecdotes that really shaped the war from, say, 1937 right through to 45.
The goal is to make sure you get that full, detailed picture, but without feeling completely overwhelmed by, well, the sheer scale of the timeline. We're moving fast, but thoroughly, event by event.
Okay, before we dive into the actual fighting, we really have to set the stage. That bitter backdrop of the post-First World War era. What was the mood like, say, in the mid-30s? What allowed all this violence to germinate?
Well, you see this stark division. On one side, you've got France and Britain,
Yeah.
the main victors, right? But they were utterly exhausted, absolutely determined not to repeat the slaughter of 1914, 1918. So their politics were all about caution, avoidance,
At
almost
any cost, it seems.
pretty much. And then you look across the Atlantic and the American feeling, profound isolationism. They just wanted to, as the sources put it, wash their hands. What they saw is this corrupt, self-destructive, just vicious old world that kept dragging itself into war.
Let them sort it out themselves.
Exactly. But then, in Central Europe, a totally different atmosphere. It was defined by humiliation, penury, all driven by those new borders drawn at Versailles. Think about the officers from the old Austro-Hungarian army suddenly finding their whole world gone. Professional pride just replaced by, well, destitution in many cases.
And the German bitterness, that was even deeper, wasn't it? Rooted in that powerful national myth.
Oh, absolutely. Their officers, many genuinely believed their armies were unbeaten right up until that sudden collapse in July 1918. The surrender just felt inexplicable, sinister even. It was fertile ground for those stabbed-in-the-back conspiracy theories.
Which fed right into the political instability.
Precisely. This whole environment, financial disaster, the Great Depression, hitting hard, rampant political factions, fighting it, made the promise of a strong authoritarian state seem, well, almost like a pragmatic, modern answer to the chaos.
And that leads us straight to the terrifyingly rapid rise of the National Socialist Party.
Terrifyingly rapid is right. In September 1930, the Nazis' share of the vote just leaped from a tiny 2.5% up to 18.3%. And it's crucial to remember, the established conservative right, they didn't respect the fragile Weimar democracy either. They basically helped destroy it from the inside.
Thinking they could control Hitler.
Yeah, they gravely underestimated his ruthlessness. They thought they could manage him, use him as some kind of populist puppet once he got into power.
A fatal miscalculation.
Completely. January 30, 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor. And you have to internalize this. His goals went way beyond just getting back the territory lost at Versailles. His ambition was nothing less than total Germanic supremacy in Europe.
And you mentioned the strategic driver behind that ideology. It wasn't just about land, it was resources, right?
Exactly. His ultimate goal was Lebensraum, living space, stretching eastward, maybe even all the way to the Volga River, and a huge driver for that eastern expansion. Oil. Simple as that.
Oil. Even in peacetime, Germany was importing, what was it?
A staggering 85% of its oil supplies. Hitler knew this energy dependence was Germany's Achilles heel in any long war, and the only place to get that kind of long-term military self-sufficiency, the vast oil fields of the Caucasus, deep inside the Soviet Union.
Right. That context is crucial. Okay, let's move into the timeline itself. So that focus on expansion takes us straight to 1937, because while Europe was still, in this tense political buildup, the war in Asia was already raging and setting new standards for brutality.
That's right. By December 1937, we see the horrific events known now as the Rape of Nanking.
Yeah.
After the Japanese captured the Chinese capital, the actions of the Japanese troops were, well, barbaric doesn't even cover it, often systematic. The sources detail them using Chinese prisoners in these killing pits for bayonet practice.
Just horrific. And this wasn't random violence, was it? It sounds almost institutionalized.
It was. The sources talk about the group ethos within the Imperial Japanese Army, often instilled through brutal collective punishment during training. It created this terrifying internal hierarchy that actually encouraged these acts. The details are hard to hear, but necessary. Senior soldiers organizing mass gang rapes.
God.
Sometimes up to 30 men per woman, followed by murder. New recruits apparently weren't even allowed to participate until they were fully accepted into the unit. It was part of the initiation, almost.
And this just became part of the war machine, formalized.
It seems so. It extended quickly to the widespread seizure of women for military brothels, the so-called comfort women. After the Nanking Massacre, the military authorities actually demanded another 3,000 women for the use of the army.
3,000?
And that was after they'd already seized over 2,000 women from the nearby city of Suzhou just a month earlier.
What was the long-term effect of using massacre and mass rape like this as a weapon?
Well, paradoxically, it was profoundly counterproductive for the Japanese war effort in the long run. It galvanized a unified resistance they just hadn't anticipated. Before the war, many rural Chinese peasants maybe didn't have a strong concept of China or Japan as nations. But the sheer visceral brutality of the occupation, it provoked this deep, enduring patriotic anger.
Creating the very unity they wanted to crush.
Exactly, leading to this unified long-term resistance that the Imperial Army ultimately could never fully stamp out.
Okay, let's shift back to Europe, 1939. The stage is being set very rapidly now for the Nazi-Soviet pact, which still seems astonishing. Why would Stalin, head of world communism, even consider aligning with Hitler, the world's most outspoken anti-communist?
Well, Stalin had been thinking about some kind of accommodation, it seems, ever since the Munich Agreement in '38. When the West basically sacrificed Czechoslovakia. He rightly suspected they were trying to push Hitler eastward, toward him.
So he started making moves internally.
Decisive moves. In May 1939, on May 3rd, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, they literally surrounded the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs building. Stalin had issued this chilling order: purge the Ministry of Jews, clean out the synagogue.
Good Lord.
The veteran diplomat Maxim Litvinov, who was Jewish and had championed collective security with the West, he was immediately replaced by Stalin's loyal man, Vyacheslav Molotov.
Sending a very clear signal to Berlin.
A crystal clear signal. Moscow was open for business. Then, on August 2nd, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, he first floats the idea of a pact. He apparently told the Soviet charge d'affaires something like, "There's no problem from the Baltic to the Black Sea that we can't solve between us."
Hinting at carving things up.
Oh, strongly hinting, right from the start, specifically mentioning Poland and the Baltic states as potential spoils.
And Stalin's strategy in all this, the source is painted as pure, cold cynicism. Right?
Utterly cynical. He used the pact to grab the Baltic states, Bessarabia, eastern Poland. But the bigger strategic game was hoping Germany and the capitalist West would just bleed each other dry in a long, bloody war, buying him precious time.
Time for the Red Army to recover from his own purges just a few years earlier.
Exactly. Those purges had crippled his officer corps. He needed time to rebuild.
So, late August 39, the final brinksmanship. Hitler's convinced Britain won't fight, right? Especially with the Soviet pact in his pocket, meaning no war on two fronts.
He was absolutely convinced,
Okay.
which led him to issue preemptive military orders, designed to seize the advantage the Second War was declared.
Like the naval orders on August 19th.
Precisely. Gross Admiral Raeder ordered the pocket battleships, Deutschland and Grafspee, plus 16 U-boats, to put to sea immediately. Head for the Atlantic just in case war was declared. Be ready.
But the initial invasion plan, the one for August 26th, that got delayed.
It did. Britain and France finally showed a bit of resolution, which made Hitler pause. What followed in those last days of August, the sources describe as a black farce of negotiations. Hitler refused to actually present any terms to Poland, wouldn't even invite an emissary from Warsaw.
He was just setting them up.
Completely. Setting this rigid deadline midnight, August 30th, determined to pin the blame for the coming war squarely on Poland's supposed refusal to negotiate. It was all about crafting the propaganda justification for the attack he was already set on launching. And then, in the early hours of September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish frontier. For most of these young German soldiers, this was it, their first taste of combat. One panzer commander described the scene right on the border, in the dark, misty forest. He called it a fantastical scene, full of tension and movement.
Meanwhile, the news hits Paris, and it's shock. They'd really held on to hopes of more appeasement, hadn't they?
They had. And the reaction was almost instant blame shifting. Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet, the arch-appeaser, immediately starts blaming the Poles for their, quote, stupid and obstinate attitude towards Germany's demands.
Unbelievable. And the Allies, especially the British, they're now in a real political crisis.
Absolutely. In London, there was real suspicion that Prime Minister Chamberlain might actually try to wriggle out of the commitment because the ultimatum they'd issued was a bit imprecise, no firm time limit. It took a huge internal pressure cooker, a cabinet crisis basically, to force the government to set that firm deadline for German withdrawal.
They were worried the French might just back out completely.
They were terrified the French would use any ambiguity as an excuse to fold.
So war is declared. But the grim reality of the German occupation in Poland starts instantly. The speed of the military campaign was one thing, but the atrocities.
They began immediately. The sources paint a truly grim picture. Official German documents suggest over 16,000 civilians were executed just during that 5-week campaign. And that figure climbs closer to 65,000 by the end of the year as the occupation, digs in.
Specific examples.
We know of 10,000 Poles and Jews massacred near a place called Mnichek, another 8,000 near Karlshof, and the Germans deliberately torched over 500 villages and towns as collective reprisals, punishing whole communities.
And what about the mindset of the soldiers carrying this out? The sources give some chilling insights there.
They do. Soldiers reported feeling profoundly nervous. Constantly watched, they felt, by hidden Poles and Jews. Unseen weapons pointed at them. This paranoia, whether it was grounded in reality or not, seemed to justify, in their minds, destroying what they saw as insalubrious and hostile villages.
A justification for brutality.
And looting was rampant, taking money, clothes, jewelry, and the intense hatred they encountered from the Polish people seemed to, again, in their minds, justify the invasion itself. It became this vicious, self-reinforcing cycle of fear and violence.
The Polish defense, despite showing immense courage, was just overwhelmed, wasn't it?
Completely overwhelmed. Their Air Force had, 159 pretty old-fashioned fighters, no match for the speed and numbers of the Messerschmitts. German mechanized tactics, the encirclements. They trapped 2 whole Polish armies near the Bzura and Vistula rivers, took 120,000 prisoners in just a matter of days.
And then Poland's fate was well and truly sealed on September 17th.
Yes. Soviet forces crossed the eastern border. Apparently, the Germans were actually surprised Stalin hadn't moved sooner. But he'd waited, very calculatedly, to make sure his attack couldn't possibly be seen by the West as an act of aggression that required them to declare war on him.
The timing was crucial, and the official Soviet excuse for invading.
Astonishing in its cynicism, they claimed they were just intervening to protect ethnic Belarusians and Ukrainians. They argued the non-aggression treaty they had with Poland was now void because the Polish government, which had literally just fled that morning, had supposedly ceased to exist.
While its ministers were racing for the Romanian border to escape the Red Army.
Exactly, cutting it very fine.
So back in the West, this period settles in the phony war, defined by Allied inaction. Why? What was the thinking?
It was deeply rooted in their military doctrine. General Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, he flatly refused any major offensive against the German West Wall, the Siegfried Line. He wanted to delay until the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, was fully deployed and all the French reservists were mobilized. French doctrine was just fundamentally defensive, fixated on fighting World War I all over again.
And the British strategy wasn't much better, focused on the blockade.
Equally flawed, really. They focused almost entirely on a naval blockade. But the sources point out the obvious flaw. The Soviet Union, now Hitler's partner in crime, could easily supply Germany with all the raw materials it needed. It made the blockade pretty ineffective from day one.
Okay, so late 39, early 40, we also have the Winter War between the Soviets and Finland. That was a shock for the Soviets, wasn't it?
A huge shock. Stalin's 7th Army got bogged down, delayed significantly by these incredibly tenacious Finnish screening forces and snipers operating in the deep snow. And in their haste, under pressure to push forward, Red Army commanders apparently marched their men straight through snow-covered minefields. No delay, no mine detectors.
Just desperate measures, especially when they'd been telling their own troops the Finns would welcome them as liberators.
Exactly. The propaganda clearly didn't match the frosty reality on the ground.
And while the land war was quiet in the West, Britain did score a big naval victory down in the South Atlantic. December 39, the Battle of the River Plate.
Yeah, a major morale booster. The German pocket battleship Graf Spee, it took some hits from 3 smaller British cruisers, broke off the fight, and limped into Montevideo Harbor in neutral Uruguay.
And the British managed a brilliant bluff there, didn't they?
They really did. Over the next few days, they fed misinformation. successfully bluffing the captain, Langsdorff, into believing his escape route was blocked by a heavily reinforced British squadron. He didn't want to risk his crew in what he thought was a hopeless battle.
So he scuttled the ship.
Settled the Graf Spee on December 17th and committed suicide shortly after. The aftermath tells you a lot about Hitler's mindset, though. He was obsessed with symbols. He immediately ordered the Graf Spee's sister ship, the Deutschland, to be renamed Lützow.
Why?
He was terrified of future newspaper headlines, proclaiming that Germany itself had been sunk. Image was everything.
Okay, 1940. The focus snaps back hard to Europe with the invasion of Scandinavia. Hitler had ordered preparations way back in March, Operation Visirebung.
Right, requiring pretty much every available surface ship Germany had.
Yeah.
The operation was set for April 9th. Visirebung north for Norway, south for Denmark. Transport ships, escorted by the Kriegsmarine, landed forces at key spots Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen. The German High Command kind of suspected they might be in a race against the British to get there first.
But they were faster.
Oh yeah, comfortably ahead in speed and coordination. But this immediate creation of a secondary front, it caused some real friction within the German command structure, didn't it?
It did. The sources say the decision to divert all those forces to Norway really alarmed parts of the German army and the Luftwaffe. They were already facing the enormous strategic challenge of invading France. Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, was reportedly furious.
Saw it as a pointless diversion of crucial resources.
Exactly. Felt he hadn't been properly consulted. But despite those internal fears, May 10th, 1940, the Western offensive kicks off. And the Allies, still thinking about 1914, basically walk straight into a carefully laid trap.
It was a grave mistake. They assumed the main German attack would come frontally, through Belgium. So the Allied formations in northeastern France, the ones designated to defend Belgium, they rushed northward towards the border, completely giving away their defensive plan.
Playing right into Manstein's hands?
Perfectly. It was exactly what General Lieutenant Erich von Manstein's brilliant replacement plan, Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut, had anticipated.
And that plan involved Army Group A under Rundstedt, driving the main panzer forces through the Ardennes forest, which the French thought was impassable for tanks.
Precisely to cut off those Allied armies racing north into Belgium. And here's where the catastrophic failure of French preparation really bites. The Deuxième Bureau of French Military Intelligence, they actually had remarkably accurate intel.
They knew.
They pinpointed the bulk of the panzer divisions massing in the Eifel region just beyond the Ardennes. They even predicted the main thrust would come at Sedan between May 8th and 10th. But astonishingly, the French Air Force leadership refused to send photo reconnaissance flights over German territory to confirm it. They essentially ignored their own intelligence.
Just dogma overriding reality. So Army Group B hits Holland and Belgium, drawing the Allies north.
Just as planned. And meanwhile, Army Group A, Rundstedt's force, snakes these huge columns of vehicles through the dense forests, screened heavily by Messerschmitt fighters overhead. Their march discipline was apparently total. Any vehicle that broke down was just shoved off the road instantly to keep the columns moving. No delays.
And the decisive moment comes at the Meuse River, May 13th.
The Meuse breakthrough. German bridgeheads established at Sedan, Dinant, Montfermeil. They opened up this massive breach nearly 80 kilometers wide. French command reaction was tragically slow. At Sedan, a crucial counterattack order was delayed by 9 hours.
9 hours.
By the time the French tanks finally engaged, they were largely knocked out, and panics just ripped through the French divisions holding that sector.
The Allies tried to hit back from the air, didn't they, against those pontoon bridges the Germans were using?
They threw everything they had at them. 152 bombers, 250 fighters, a massive effort to try and stop the flow of German armor across the Meuse.
And the result?
An absolute disaster for the Allies. German anti-aircraft fire, the flak, and the patrolling Messerschmitts just tore them apart. The RAF lost 40 out of 71 bombers sent that day, their worst casualty rate ever in a single operation. The French used obsolete bombers and were simply massacred. The failure meant the Panthers could just keep rolling, basically unmolested towards the coast.
The collapse just gathers speed. The British try a counterattack near Arras with those heavy Matilda tanks.
Yeah, about 74 Matildas. Designed to try and cut off Rommel's spearhead, which was racing ahead. Rommel himself was right there, saw his own troops starting to panic and run, but he reacted incredibly fast.
How so?
He personally directed his anti-tank guns and, crucially, his 88mm anti-aircraft guns, using them in an anti-tank role.
Yeah.
He nearly got killed in the firefight himself, but his quick actions stopped the British attack cold, saved the Germans from a potentially serious setback that could have split their advance.
By May 23rd, the situation looks desperate, leading to the Boulogne evacuation. Royal Navy destroyers are pulling out troops while firing their main guns at German tanks on the docks.
An incredible image, isn't it? But it created huge political fallout. The French commander there had been ordered to fight to the last man. He was absolutely outraged, accused the British of desertion. The sources say it did much to embitter relations further between the Allies at a critical moment.
Then May 25th, the decision comes from London. Lord Gort, head of the BF, is told to withdraw towards the coast, prioritize saving the British army.
Right. They were forced to accept that the French army simply couldn't recover from the shock. This was the moment the Dunkirk evacuation became official policy. It started the very next day, May 26th.
Dunkirk is often called a miracle. What actually allowed so many troops to get away under constant attack?
Well, several factors. There was a heavy storm at times, which hampered air attacks. But crucially, the sources point out that the bombs dropped by the Luftwaffe had a much lower lethal effect on the beaches because the soft sand dunes absorbed so much of the blast.
So fewer casualties than expected from the bombing.
Comparatively few, yes, considering the masses of men exposed on the beaches. Instead of the perhaps 45,000 troops they initially hoped to save, they got out 338,000 Allied soldiers, about 193,000 of them British. A strategic deliverance, definitely. But the cost was still immense. 68,000 British casualties, and almost all their heavy equipment had to be abandoned or destroyed.
With the BEF gone, France collapses. Mid-June, Churchill flies to Tours. What does he find?
He finds the French Prime Minister, Reynaud, completely paralyzed, surrounded by defeatists in his own government. Reynaud basically asked Churchill to release France from their agreement not to seek a separate peace. The political will was broken.
5 days later, Hitler meets Mussolini in Munich. What terms does Hitler impose on France?
Surprisingly lenient in some ways. He tells Mussolini the armistice terms. But notably, Hitler refuses to impose truly punitive conditions. He doesn't let Italy just grab the French fleet or its colonies. He preferred to keep a semi-autonomous French state, Vichy France, managing the unoccupied zone, perhaps hoping it might lure Britain into negotiating a peace deal too.
A strategic calculation. But that didn't stop the next grim chapter. Operation Catapult, July 3rd, 1940. The British attack on the French fleet. Why?
Pure strategic necessity from the British perspective. They simply could not risk the powerful French fleet falling into German hands. It would have tilted the naval balance catastrophically.
So they attacked their own allies' fleet at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria.
Yes. HMS Hood and 2 battleships opened fire on the French ships anchored at Oran. The results were devastating. The modern battlecruiser Dunkirk and the battleship Provence were badly damaged. The older battleship Bretagne blew up and capsized. Over 1,000 French sailors killed.
And the political consequence?
Immediate and severe. The rampant anti-British feeling already simmering in Petain's Vichy government turned into what the sources call visceral loathing. Diplomatic relations were completely broken off, a really low point in Anglo-French history.
With France now out of the war, the Battle of Britain begins in earnest over the summer. German morale is sky high.
Absolutely. The pilots were flush with victory after France. Goering boasted they'd achieved victory over Britain in less than a month, and numerically, the Luftwaffe had the edge. About 1,143 fighters and bombers ready against Air Chief Marshal Dowding's fighter command, which had around 504 operational Hurricanes and Spitfires.
What was the core RAF strategy to counter that numerical disadvantage?
It was very sophisticated, devised by Dowding. The absolute priority was to break up the formations of German bombers before their escorting Me-109 fighters could intervene effectively. So the faster, higher-climbing Spitfires were generally tasked with engaging the German fighters, tying them up, while the slightly slower but more heavily armed Hurricanes concentrated on attacking the bombers themselves.
Divide and conquer, essentially. And the other critical factor that saved Britain was production, wasn't it?
It was absolutely crucial. The Germans made a fatal miscalculation here. They just failed to appreciate the sheer scale of British aircraft production, coordinated by Lord Beaverbrook. Britain was churning out 470 new fighters a month.
Double the German rate.
Roughly double their own production rate, which meant British losses, though heavy, could be replaced almost immediately, whereas German losses were cumulative and much harder to replace, especially trained pilots. That industrial difference was decisive in the long run.
As 1940 wears on, the focus starts shifting south to the Mediterranean. Hitler meets Franco, the Spanish dictator, but Franco refuses to join the Axis.
Yes. Despite Hitler putting on immense pressure, Franco was worried, rightly, about provoking a British attack, maybe on the Canary Islands. And Spain was heavily reliant on grain and oil shipments from the United States, which joining the Axis would cut off. He basically told Hitler Spain could only join if Britain collapsed first.
How did Hitler take that?
Furiously. The sources quote him calling Franco a Jesuit swine
Ugh.
afterwards. He felt betrayed.
And he was even more furious a bit later, October 28th, when Mussolini launched his invasion of Greece.
Oh, incandescent with rage. He saw it as a disastrously timed, strategically idiotic move. He was terrified it would inevitably draw British forces into Greece, potentially giving the RAF bases close enough to bomb the absolutely vital Ploesti oil fields in Romania.
Which could jeopardize his real target, the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa.
Exactly. Mussolini's Greek adventure put Barbarossa potentially at risk. And to make it worse, Mussolini's boast that he'd occupy Greece in 15 days just evaporated. The Italian offensive was poorly planned, poorly executed. Their best troops soon got bogged down, even surrounded by the Greeks.
Leading Hitler to make a rather cutting remark.
Yes, he correctly predicted that the Greeks would prove to be much better soldiers than the Italians. A humiliating failure from Mussolini.
And this Italian humiliation directly set the stage for a British success in North Africa. Operation Compass, December 9th, 1940.
It did. General Wavell achieved complete surprise against the Italians in Egypt. He even threw a big party the night before the attack to lull suspicion. The Indian Division, spearheaded by those heavily armored Matilda tanks, which the Italians had no answer to, just smashed through the main Italian positions near Sidi Barrani, took them in less than 36 hours.
The scale of the Italian collapse there was staggering, wasn't it?
Absolutely enormous. Mass surrenders followed almost immediately. 4 entire Italian divisions in the area just gave up by December 11th. The final blow came in early February 41 when the flamboyant Italian general Bergonzoli, nicknamed Electric Whiskers, surrendered. That marked the effective end of the Italian 10th Army.
And the number of prisoners taken was just overwhelming.
So overwhelming that when a young British subaltern was asked by his HQ for an exact count of the prisoners his unit had taken, he supposedly radioed back, several acres, I would think. Gives you a sense of the scale. And just 5 days after Bergonzoli's surrender, a German general landed in Tripoli to try and salvage the situation. His name was Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox had arrived.
So, 1941, Germany pushes into the Balkans. Things escalate in Yugoslavia. Prince Paul signs the Axis Pact on March 25th.
But just 2 days later, Serbian officers, backed by a popular uprising, seize power in Belgrade. Hitler is left, according to the sources, gasping for revenge. Absolutely livid, he immediately orders Operation Strafgericht Retribution. Bomb Belgrade flat. No ultimatum, just pure punishment.
And meanwhile, preparations for Operation Merida, the invasion of Greece, are continuing.
Yes, that's rolling forward in parallel. Which brings us to a really crucial moment, especially in terms of intelligence. The Battle of Crete in May 1941. General Wavell, back in Cairo, had estimated the main German airborne assault would involve maybe 5,000 to 6,000 airborne troops, plus a possible smaller sea landing.
But the commander on Crete, General Freiberg, he made a critical error in assessing that threat, didn't he, based on the intelligence?
He did. Freiberg became obsessed with the idea of a large seaborne invasion. He really feared the Royal Navy wouldn't be able to stop it, so he focused his best troops on defending the beaches. This was despite Wavell telling him the Axis simply didn't have the naval strength for a major sea landing.
And even when they got crucial intelligence from ultra-decrypts.
Exactly. Even when ultra-decrypts arrived around May 6th, showing clearly that the Germans planned to land 2 divisions, double Wavell's initial estimate almost entirely by air, confirming the main threat was airborne. Freiberg still focused his planning on searching for a beach landing with tanks. He just couldn't shake that preconceived idea.
And that fixation on the wrong threat led to immediate tactical failures when the Germans actually landed.
It absolutely did.
Mm-hmm.
Communications on Crete were terrible anyway, which didn't help. But when Colonel Andrew, commanding the forces near the vital Malem airfield, desperately requested reinforcements for a counterattack to retake it, his immediate superior hesitated, heavily influenced by Freiberg's obsession with the sea threat.
So the counterattack never happened.
It was delayed and mismanaged. Malem Airfield and the crucial Hill 107 overlooking it were abandoned during the night. That allowed the Germans to fly in reinforcements unimpeded the next day, paving the way for their eventual costly victory. It was a tragic failure of command, communication, and intelligence interpretation.
A very costly victory for the Germans, too, though, especially their paratroopers.
Extremely costly, so much so that Hitler arguably never risked a large-scale airborne operation like that again.
Okay, so we reach the pivotal moment of the European War, perhaps the entire war. June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The surprise was total, wasn't it?
Absolutely total. The Red Army was caught completely flat-footed. Stalin had made this colossal strategic blunder by forcing his armies to advance right up to the new border, agreed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Those new positions were completely unprepared, barely fortified.
And their defense plan assumed they'd have warning?
Their official plan assumed 10 to 15 days warning before the main German forces engaged. They got zero warning. The blow was immediate and devastating.
The initial German success was just terrifying in its speed and scale.
Yeah. Airfields were hit first, preemptively. Around 1,800 Soviet planes destroyed, mostly on the ground, in the first day or two. The Luftwaffe lost only about 35 aircraft in achieving that. Panzer formations just dashed ahead in what were described as perfect summer conditions.
But there's a crucial logistical point here, often missed, isn't there, about the Wehrmacht not being fully mechanized?
That's right. Despite its reputation, the vast transport logistics supporting that blitzkrieg depended incredibly heavily on horses. Over 600,000 horses were used in the invasion, just like Napoleon's Grande Armée over a century earlier. Much of its supply chain was still fundamentally pre-industrial. That would become a massive problem later on, especially in the mud in winter.
And Stalin's reaction to the disaster, predictably brutal.
Paranoia and purges. Hapless Soviet commanders were scapegoated. General Pavlov, who commanded the Western Front where the initial collapse was worst, was summarily recalled to Moscow, tried by the NKVD, and executed, along with his staff.
And immediately crossing that Soviet frontier, the Holocaust begins in earnest. The Shoah by bullets.
Yes. Carried out initially by these specialized units, the Einsatzgruppen, following right behind the frontline troops. And it's important to note many of the very early massacres, like the 24,000 Jews killed in western Ukraine or 3,800 in Kaunas, Lithuania, were actually carried out by local Lithuanian and Ukrainian anti-Semites and nationalists, often encouraged or at least watched by German soldiers.
The methods used by the Einsatzgruppen themselves were systematically horrific.
Unspeakably so. Victims typically forced to dig their own mass graves, forced to undress so their clothes and any valuables could be collected, then shot, usually in the back of the head, falling into the pit. The forces also describe the so-called sardine method, forcing victims to lie down flat on top of the bodies already in the grave before being shot themselves, creating layers of dead, maximizing space, minimizing effort.
Were regular army units involved in the killing?
Generally, no. Frontline Wehrmacht units were usually ordered not to participate directly, though there were exceptions. The SS Wiking Division, which was Waffen SS but fought alongside the army, certainly participated. And some regular infantry divisions were implicated in atrocities too. But even if they weren't pulling the triggers,
They were witnesses.
they were absolutely witnesses. Despite army orders explicitly forbidding soldiers from even watching the mass killings, the sources confirmed that increasing numbers of off-duty German soldiers turned up, just to watch, take photographs. Some apparently even volunteered to help with the shooting when the SS units were undermanned or fatigued.
And this phase, the Shoah by bullets, eventually leads to the decision for industrialized slaughter.
Yes. The terrible strategic logic, as revealed in the sources, was that by late 1941, early 1942, it became clear there was no viable territorial solution, no place to just dump millions of Jews to starve in ghettos or remote territories. So the strategy shifted decisively towards industrialized mass murder. This led directly to the establishment and expansion of the dedicated extermination camps. Chemno, Bojik, Sobibor, Treblinka, and the largest and most infamous, Auschwitz-Birkenau.
While this horror is unfolding and escalating in the East, the war suddenly explodes globally. December 1941, the Pacific War erupts.
Right. On December 6, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts decipher a key Japanese diplomatic message. It strongly indicates war is imminent, possibly within hours. President Roosevelt reads the decrypted signal and reportedly says, quite simply, this means war.
And the attacks came almost immediately across the Pacific.
It's simultaneously, really.
Yeah.
Early on December 8th, which was still December 7th in Hawaii, of course, Japanese forces land at Kota Baru in British Malaya. A few hours later, Japanese bombers raid Singapore, which was still unbelievably a blaze of lights, completely unprepared.
And then the huge naval disaster off Malaya.
The sinking of the brand new battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser repulsed by Japanese torpedo bombers. Churchill was stunned. This event demonstrated, absolutely irrevocably, that the age of the battleship dominating naval warfare was over. Air power was king. And it left the Imperial Japanese Navy completely unchallenged across the vast Pacific Ocean.
Hitler's reaction to Pearl Harbor and the widening war, he actually declared war on the United States on December 11th, which seems strategically mad. Why?
He rejoiced. His calculation, faulty as it turned out, was that America which had a relatively small army at the time, would be completely bogged down fighting Japan in the Pacific for years. He figured they wouldn't be able to intervene decisively in Europe until 1943 at the very earliest. So declaring war seemed low risk and tied Germany closer to its successful Japanese ally.
A massive strategic gift to Churchill and the Allies, really, bringing the U.S. fully into the European war.
Absolutely enormous, one of his biggest blunders.
And meanwhile, during the fall of Hong Kong around the same time, there's that revealing detail about the British garrison.
Yes, the sources note that British officers there shrank from the idea of fully arming the local Chinese population to help defend the colony. Apparently, they preferred the prospect of losing Hong Kong to the Japanese, rather than potentially seeing it fall into the hands of Chinese nationalists who might want to reclaim it permanently after the war. A very colonial mindset, even in extremists.
Back on the Eastern Front, December 41, the German offensive finally grinds to a halt in the snows outside Moscow.
Yes. And the Red Army launches this massive counterattack starting December 5th. The German infantry, utterly exhausted, poorly equipped for the savage cold temperatures, were dropping below -30°C. They were just collapsing. Soldiers struggling terribly, frostbite rampant, boots frozen solid.
And Hitler's reaction to this setback.
Rage, and doubling down on rigid defense. He dismissed Heinz Guderian, one of his best panzer commanders, for daring to suggest tactical withdrawals to better defensive lines. And then, crucially, Hitler appointed himself commander-in-chief of the army, replacing Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. He ordered his troops to stand fast, hold every position, no matter the cost.
There's still debate about that decision, isn't there? Whether it prevented a total Napoleonic-style collapse or just caused horrific, unnecessary losses by freezing troops in impossible positions.
Exactly. Military historians still argue about the wisdom or folly of that stand-fast order. Okay, so 1942 begins with the Japanese advance looking unstoppable. In Malaya, General Tomoyuki Yamashita's troops, battle-hardened from China, are just pushing the Allied forces back relentlessly down the peninsula. And the British commander, General Arthur Percival, he makes this disastrous decision.
Not digging in.
Refusing to establish a strong final defense lineup in Johor, north of Singapore Island. Why? He apparently thought it would be bad for morale among the troops and civilians in Singapore to see defenses being prepared so close to the city.
Astonishing lack of foresight, which proved catastrophic for Singapore itself.
It did. By dawn on February 9th, nearly 20,000 Japanese troops had landed on Singapore Island itself. The city quickly descended into chaos. A bombed, burning wreck, the air thick with the smell of smoke and grimly rotting bodies. Mass evacuations were attempted, but they were chaotic. Ships packed with civilians were bombed and sunk just offshore. Survivors who managed to swim ashore were often just bayoneted or shot by Japanese patrols consolidating their beachheads.
And the treatment of prisoners and civilians under the Japanese occupation was notoriously brutal.
Savagely repressive. The Kempeitai, the Japanese military security police, ran a regime of terror. We know about 2,000 European civilians were crammed into Changi Jail, which was originally built to hold maybe 600 prisoners, and the humiliation of British and Australian POWs was systematic.
Particularly by the guards.
Often by their Korean guards or by anti-British Sikh guards who had actually deserted from the British Indian Army. These guards particularly seemed to relish enforcing the Japanese custom of slapping the faces of their former colonial masters if they failed to bow correctly or show sufficient deference, a total inversion of the old power structure.
Elsewhere in Asia, a similar story unfolds. Burma.
Yes, Japanese reinforcements and total air superiority force. The Burma Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General William Slim, who would later prove a brilliant commander into a rapid, difficult retreat starting in March. And the liaison between the British and the Chinese forces fighting alongside them was apparently chaotic, partly because the Chinese troops, incredibly, had no maps. And even if the British gave them maps, they couldn't read the English place names on them. Basic coordination was impossible sometimes.
And the Philippines fall too.
Overwhelming Japanese force captures the Bataan Peninsula on April 9th. The American and Filipino defenders fought bravely, but were starving and riddled with disease. Major General Jonathan Wainwright, who took command after MacArthur left, was finally forced to surrender the island fortress of Corregidor the Rock on May 6. It had just been pulverized into submission by relentless bombing and naval gunfire. The situation was utterly hopeless. Less than a quarter of his men were even fit to fight by the end.
Okay, let's swing back to the Desert War in North Africa, mid-1942. Rommel, despite having huge supply problems and his troops suffering low morale after earlier setbacks, he manages another tactical success at the Battle of Gazala.
He does. A complex, swirling battle. And then, on June 20th, he achieves a massive strategic prize, the capture of the major port of Tobruk, which the Allies had held onto for so long. Its fall causes absolute panic back in Cairo.
Panic? How bad?
The sources described columns of smoke rising from the gardens of British HQ and the embassy as staff frantically burned secret documents, creating this bizarre snowstorm of partly charred papers drifting over the city. And in the detail that just sums up the chaos, street vendors were apparently running around snatching up these still smoldering secret papers to use them to make paper cones for selling peanuts.
Incredible. So the fall of Tobruk shifts Hitler's focus for the summer offensive on the Eastern Front, right? Operation Blau, the drive south toward the Caucasus oil fields, and Stalingrad.
It's exactly. Initial German successes in the south, spearheaded by Manstein's counterattacks, restored a sense of victory after the Moscow debacle. But the German generals, they remained deeply uneasy. They feared the sheer vastness of the landmass they were trying to conquer, and the inevitable return of the brutal Russian winter.
By August 42, Paulus's 6th Army and Hoth's 4th Panzer Army are closing in on Stalingrad. Why was holding the city so vital for Stalin?
It was critical, both symbolically, the city bearing his name, and strategically. Losing Stalingrad meant potentially losing control of the Volga River, a vital transport artery, and it would open the way for the Germans to cut off the oil supplies coming up from the Caucasus. That's why Stalin issued his famous Order Number 227, not one step back.
And Stalingrad quickly becomes this horrific meat grinder, urban warfare at its most brutal.
Unbelievably brutal. General Vasily Chukov, the commander of the 62nd Army, desperately defending the city, he ordered NKVD troops, the political police, to set up blocking detachments behind his own lines, their job, to shoot any Soviet soldiers trying to retreat or desert, to literally force men back into the inferno.
And the civilians?
Trapped. Estimates vary wildly, but maybe somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 civilians were caught in the city, sheltering in cellars beneath the rubble as the battle raged over their heads for months. Meanwhile, the German soldiers pushing into the city were being told, back in early September, that capturing Stalingrad meant the war on the Eastern Front would basically be over. Victory seemed imminent.
But the fighting was street by street, building by building. And the sniper war was particularly vicious.
Intense. It became this incredibly personal, psychological battle fought amidst the ruins. Snipers on both sides stalked each other. They specifically targeted officers, NCOs, even soldiers just trying to fetch water from the Volga under the cover of darkness. Men were tortured by thirst in the heat and dust.
And there are reports of snipers targeting children.
Yes. Some of the most shocking reports, detailed in the sources, suggest that Soviet snipers were ordered to shoot Russian children. Why? Because desperate German soldiers, also running low on water, had apparently started bribing these kids with crusts of bread to sneak down to the Volga River bank and fill their water bottles for them. The snipers shot the children to stop this. Just the absolute depths of brutality.
But while the Germans are being drawn deeper and deeper into this costly street fighting, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, they're planning something much bigger.
Meticulously. They'd been secretly building up massive reserve armies on the flanks north and south of Stalingrad for months, using Chukov's bleeding 62nd Army almost as bait, holding the Germans fixated on the city itself while preparing this huge pincer movement. The codename for the trap was Operation Uranus.
Just before Uranus is sprung, though, another major event happens, Operation Torch. The Allied landings in North Africa, November 8th, 1942.
Right, a huge strategic move. But it immediately presented the Allied commander, Eisenhower, with a major political headache. To secure a ceasefire with the Vichy French forces in North Africa, who initially resisted the landings, Eisenhower was forced to make a deal with Admiral François Darlan,
who was a high-ranking Vichy official, basically a collaborator.
Exactly, a very senior figure in Petain's regime. Churchill, back in London, was extremely reluctant to endorse any deal with Darlan. But Eisenhower argued it was a military necessity to stop the fighting quickly and save Allied lives. It was deeply controversial.
And Hitler's reaction to the Torch landings?
Immediate suspicion. He didn't trust the Vichy French an inch. The landings confirmed his fears. On November 10th, he ordered German troops to invade the previously unoccupied Vichy zone in southern France, seizing the whole country, though the French managed to scuttle most of their remaining fleet at Toulon before the Germans could grab it.
Meanwhile, back in Egypt, the tide had already decisively turned. Montgomery takes command of the 8th Army.
And immediately brings this wave of self-confidence. He meticulously prepares his offensive, Operation Lightfoot, launched at El Alamein on October 23rd. He deliberately focused the main attack on the most heavily defended northern sector of Rommel's line, correctly anticipating Rommel would expect the main blow in the south and be wrong-footed.
And Rommel knew the game was up.
He was quickly convinced the tide had turned irrevocably against him, overwhelming Allied superiority in tanks, guns, air power. What followed was Rommel conducting arguably one of the most skillfully managed parts of his entire desert campaign, a long fighting retreat across Libya, delaying Montgomery, saving much of his army, but retreating nonetheless.
But on the Eastern Front, the trap springs. November 19th, Operation Uranus launches.
The Soviet counteroffensive begins. Massive pincers crashing through the weaker Romanian and Italian forces guarding the flanks of the German Sixth Army. Within days, Paulus's entire army, plus parts of the 4th Panzer Army, maybe 250,000 to 300,000 men, are completely encircled inside Stalingrad.
And their fate is sealed by Goering's promise.
Goering's disastrously false promise to Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped 6th Army entirely by air. It was impossible. The army needed a minimum of 700 tons of supplies per day just to survive. Goering boasted the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons. In reality, on their best days, they barely managed 100, maybe 150 tons, never reaching the theoretical maximum of 350. It was a logistical fantasy, a lie, that condemned the 6th Army to starvation and freezing death.
So the beginning of 1943 sees the fate of the 6th Army in Stalingrad. Manstein's relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, gets agonizingly close but ultimately fails. And Hitler
Stubbornly refuses to allow a breakout attempt. He orders Paulus to hold Fortress Stalingrad to the last man, forbidding surrender. Purely for propaganda reasons, it seems.
The conditions inside that pocket, the Kessel, must have been unimaginable.
Atrocious. The sources describe soldiers suffering terribly from lice infestation, the constant gnawing hunger, and the unbelievable cold, down to -30, -40 degrees. Potomnik Airfield, their only tenuous link to the outside world for supplies and evacuation, became this nightmare scene of frozen corpses piled up, wrecked aircraft, and desperate, starving men fighting for a place on the last planes out.
When Paulus finally does surrender on February 2nd, the number of prisoners is still huge.
About 91,000 German soldiers were taken captive. But tragically, the Red Army was completely unprepared to handle such a massive influx of starving, freezing, sick men. Nearly half of those prisoners died from disease, exposure, or malnutrition in the makeshift Soviet camps by the time spring arrived just a few months later.
And Hitler's reaction to Paulus surrendering rather than committing suicide?
Absolute fury. He saw it as a profound personal betrayal, a stain on German military honor. He couldn't comprehend how a field marshal could choose capture over death.
Meanwhile, in North Africa, the endgame is approaching. There's a temporary setback for the Allies at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia.
Yes. Rommel launches a surprise counterattack in February 43, hitting inexperienced American troops hard. It breaks right through their lines. One American commander, Major General Harmon, described it grimly as the only time he ever saw an American army en route. A real shock for the U.S. forces.
But it was temporary.
Only temporary.
Yeah.
The Allies regrouped, poured in reinforcements. By May 1943, the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia, German and Italian, were finally trapped against the sea, completely cut off. Hitler, again delusionally, convinced himself that forcing them to fight to the very end would somehow delay the inevitable Allied invasion of southern Europe. It just led to another massive surrender, hundreds of thousands more Axis prisoners.
Out on the Atlantic, the U-boat war reaches its peak, its climax, around the same time, March 1943.
Yes, March 43 was the deadliest month for Allied shipping. In one brutal battle around convoy HX-229 SC-122, the U-boat Wolfpack sank 21 merchant ships in just one night. It really felt like they might be winning the Battle of the Atlantic.
But the tide turned incredibly quickly after that.
Very quickly. May 1943 is seen as the turning point. Several factors came together. The arrival of new long-range B-24 Liberator aircraft, based in Iceland and Newfoundland, finally closed the mid-Atlantic air gap where U-boats had roamed freely. Combined with improved radar technology, better convoy escorts, and crucial breakthroughs in cracking the German naval Enigma codes.
It made life hell for the U-boats.
It turned the Bay of Biscay, where the U-boats headed to surface to transit to their hunting grounds, into a killing ground for RAF coastal command patrols. U-boat losses skyrocketed. Donetsk was forced to withdraw the Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic. It was a quiet, unglamorous, but absolutely decisive strategic victory for the Allies. It saved Britain from potential economic strangulation.
Okay, let's talk about the strategic bombing campaign over Germany. It had been going on for a while, but often criticized for its early inaccuracy.
That's right. The famous Butt Report back in September 1941 revealed just how inaccurate RAF Bomber Command was. It showed that only about one aircraft in five was dropping its bombs within 5 miles of the designated target. 5 miles.
So hitting specific factories or marshalling yards was almost impossible.
Pretty much impossible, especially at night. This shocking inaccuracy was a major factor in the shift towards area bombing, targeting entire city centers, aiming to destroy housing, infrastructure, and civilian morale, rather than specific military or industrial targets.
And the initial British policy restrictions on bombing civilian areas had changed earlier.
Yes, the unwritten rules changed after the Luftwaffe accidentally bombed London in August 1940 during the Battle of Britain. That gave Churchill the political cover to authorize retaliatory raids on Berlin, and from there, the escalation towards widespread area bombing began under Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris.
The psychological toll on the bomber crews must have been immense, flying night after night into flak and night fighters.
Unbelievable stress. The source is, quote, one pilot saying starkly, "You must leave your imagination behind on the ground or it will do you harm." Seeing another aircraft near you suddenly disintegrate in a giant ball of fire, knowing it could easily have been you. Mid-air collisions in the crowded bomber streams were also a constant fear. The losses were horrific. Bomber Command lost more aircrew than the British Army lost officers in the entire First World War.
And the destructive power reached a peak with raids like the Hamburg firestorm in late July 43.
Operation Gomorrah, a series of raids that created a true firestorm. Temperatures reached hundreds of degrees Celsius. Winds sucked oxygen out of the air raid shelters, asphyxiating thousands. Tens of thousands died in Hamburg in just a few nights. It demonstrated the terrifying potential of concentrated area bombing.
Shifting back to the Eastern Front, July 1943, the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. The Germans launch Operation Citadel.
Yes, Hitler's last major offensive gamble in the East. But the Soviets knew it was coming. They had excellent intelligence, partly from spies, partly from code breaking. They knew exactly where the German pincers would strike.
So they were ready.
They were incredibly well prepared. On July 4th, German probing attacks began. But after the Soviets captured a German soldier who revealed the exact H-hour for the main assault, 03.00 hours, the next morning, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Soviet Central Front, didn't wait. He launched a massive, preemptive artillery bombardment against the German assembly areas,
Spoiling the German surprise.
completely ruining it. German commanders were shocked by the lack of surprise. When the panzers finally rolled forward, they ran into incredibly deep, well-prepared Soviet defenses, minefields, anti-tank ditches, layer upon layer of guns. Soviet soldiers showed what the sources call suicidal bravery, literally running up to tanks with mines.
And the climax at Prokhorovka.
The most famous part of the battle. A swirling, chaotic melee. Hundreds of German and Soviet tanks battling at point-blank range, often literally man-to-man, as one account put it. In that close quarters chaos, dust and smoke, all the German technological advantages, better gunnery, better optics, better radio communication, were largely negated. It just became a brutal slugfest.
Leaving behind a battlefield littered with wreckage.
An immense concentration of burned-out tanks and vehicles. Kursk was a decisive Soviet defensive victory. It bled the German Panzer Arm white. Germany would never again launch a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From then on, they were on the defensive.
While Kursk is raging, the Allies launched their invasion of Italy, starting with Sicily on July 10, 1943. Operation Husky.
Yes. The landings themselves were a bit chaotic, especially the airborne drops, but ultimately successful against initially weak Italian resistance. Montgomery's 8th Army, landing on the eastern side, advanced against lighter opposition than the American 7th Army under General George S. Patton, landing further west.
Patton gets into trouble in Sicily, doesn't he? Beyond the infamous slapping incidents.
He does. Riled by what he saw as excessive British influence and Montgomery getting the easier route, Patton pushed his forces hard in a race for Messina. But during that drive, there was a massacre of about 70 unarmed Italian prisoners by U.S. troops, an incident that was apparently covered up by military authorities at the time, fearing German reprisals against Allied POWs if it became widely known.
And the German reaction to the invasion of Sicily and Mussolini's subsequent overthrow.
Swift and brutal. As soon as Mussolini was deposed, Hitler launched the pre-planned Operation Axis, formerly called Alarich. German forces rapidly disarmed the Italian army throughout Italy and the occupied territories. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring skillfully seized control of Rome. Around 650,000 Italian soldiers were captured and treated as POWs, many shipped off to Germany for forced labor under terrible conditions. Italy went from Allied to occupied territory overnight.
The subsequent Allied landing on the Italian mainland at Salerno September 9th was much tougher going.
Extremely tough. Heavy German counterattacks by Kesselring's forces almost pushed the Allies right back into the sea. General Mark Clark, commanding the U.S. Fifth Army, was determined to be crowned the conqueror of Rome.
Yeah.
But that goal was delayed for many months by the series of formidable German defensive positions built across the mountainous Italian peninsula, the Gustav Line being the most famous. Italy turned into a long, slow, bloody grind.
And throughout this period, the sheer brutality of the German occupation, especially on the Eastern Front, continues unabated even as they retreat.
Yes, the sources describe German soldiers systematically seizing food and livestock from terrified civilians, smashing beehives just to get the honey, ignoring pleas that the victims would starve over the winter. Some soldiers apparently wrote home wistfully comparing the harsh conditions and scarce loot in Russia to the rich pickings they remembered from the fall of France back in 1940.
And meanwhile, the Holocaust is reaching its most industrialized phase in the death camps.
Yes. Chemno, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bershik, Auschwitz-Birkenau. The SS running these camps became chillingly proficient at exploiting what the sources call the victims' instinctive optimism, making the arrival process seem relatively benign, sorting luggage, promises of showers to keep people calm, easier to control, less likely to panic until the very last moment. Deception was key to the efficiency of the industrialized murder.
And we have to mention again the infamous medical experiments.
Absolutely horrific. The notorious experiments conducted at Auschwitz by Dr. Josef Mengele, twins experiments, sterilization experiments, and also at Dachau concentration camp, where the sources state over 12,000 prisoners died just from the medical experiments alone. These included high-altitude pressure tests for the Luftwaffe, freezing prisoners in ice water to study hypothermia.
And that detail about using human skin.
Yes. One of the most grotesque details from the sources concerns Dachau. Prisoners working in the pathology lab were apparently forced by SS personnel to process the skin of deceased non-German inmates, specifically selecting skin with interesting tattoos or good texture, tanning it, and using it to make items like saddles, riding breeches, gloves, house slippers, and ladies' handbags for SS officers and their families. Just absolute depravity.
Shifting focus back north, the epic siege of Leningrad is finally broken in January 1944. How did the Soviets achieve the breakthrough?
Through meticulous preparation and secrecy. Over a period of 2 months, they secretly ferried the entire Second Shock Army, troops and equipment, across the frozen Lake Ladoga into the small Iranian-bound bridgehead, a pocket of Soviet resistance west of Leningrad that the Germans had never managed to eliminate.
How many troops?
Around 22,000 troops, 140 tanks, hundreds of guns, all moved secretly across the frozen Gulf of Finland into this bridgehead, right into the Germans' noses.
And then the attack.
On January 14th, a massive artillery barrage opens up. 21,600 Soviet guns firing over 220,000 shells in just 100 minutes. The ground literally trembled up to 20 kilometers away. Then came the coordinated attack. Out of the Oranienbaum bridgehead hitting the German flank and simultaneously from the Pulkovo heights south of Leningrad. The German commander was completely shocked, realizing his whole flank had just been enveloped. The siege was broken after nearly 900 days.
An incredible feat of logistics and deception. And then comes June 1944, the massive twin blows against Nazi Germany, D-Day in the west, Operation Bagration in the east.
A catastrophic summer for the Wehrmacht. In Normandy, Hitler was apparently convinced the Allied invasion, when it came, would be smashed right on the beaches. Rommel, who Hitler had put in charge of strengthening the Atlantic Wall defenses, knew better. He privately admitted the wall was just a bit of cheap bluff in many places.
And Rommel had serious fears about Allied air power.
Huge fears. This led to a major strategic debate within the German high command. Rommel wanted the Panzer reserves deployed much further forward, right behind the beaches, so they could counterattack immediately before Allied air power could intervene decisively. But his superiors, including Rundstedt and Hitler himself, preferred to keep the Panzers further back as a central reserve, fearing they'd be destroyed by naval gunfire if they were too close to the coast, a crucial disagreement with major consequences.
And on D-Day itself, June 6th, there's a key failure on the Allied side regarding Kalin.
Yes. Capturing the city of Kalin on D-Day itself was a primary objective for the British forces landing on Sword Beach. But largely due to the British 3rd Infantry Division being too cautious, perhaps, and slow in pushing inland aggressively, they failed to seize Kalin quickly.
Which had big consequences.
Huge consequences. It meant Cayenne became the anchor of the German defense in Normandy. It took Montgomery's forces over a month of brutal, grinding attritional warfare to finally capture the ruined city. This slow progress tied down significant German armored forces, but also led to considerable friction between the Allied commanders.
While the Allies are bogged down around Caen, the Soviets launch Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front, June 22nd, the anniversary of Barbarossa.
A massive, devastating offensive against German army group center in Belarusia. Marshal Rokossovsky achieved brilliant surprise by launching his main thrust through the supposedly impassable Pripyat marshes, similar in effect to the German Ardennes attack in 1940. It completely unhinged the German front line.
How bad was it for the Germans?
Catastrophic. Almost the entire German Ninth Army was surrounded and destroyed near Bobruisk by June 26th. Army Group Center effectively ceased to exist as a coherent force. It was arguably the single biggest defeat suffered by the Wehrmacht in the entire war, and Hitler's reaction.
Forbidding retreat again.
Absolutely. Refusing to allow any withdrawals, sacking commanders like Field Marshals Busch and Model when they tried to argue for tactical flexibility. Just demanding they stand fast, leading to even greater losses. Sheer folly driven by ideology.
The desperation within parts of the German high command becomes palpable, culminating in the July 20th plot against Hitler.
Yeah.
Stauffenberg places the bomb.
Yes, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg pushes the briefcase containing the bomb under the heavy oak map table during the conference at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters. He makes his excuses and leaves. He sees the explosion from his car, is convinced Hitler must be dead, and flies back to Berlin to try and trigger the planned coup, Operation Valkyrie.
But it fails. Why?
Primarily because Hitler miraculously survived the blast. He was shielded by the incredibly thick, heavy oak table leg. Plus, there was profound confusion and hesitation among the conspirators back in Berlin. They didn't act decisively enough. And it's crucial to remember the sources emphasize these plotters were a tiny minority within the German military and society. Most remained loyal, or at least passive.
And the Nazi vengeance.
Savage, swift, and overwhelming. Thousands were arrested, tortured, executed. Families were punished under the doctrine of Sippenhaft, kin liability.
Just a month later, August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising begins. Launched by the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa.
Yes. The sources describe the young Home Army fighters, trained and armed underground for years, as almost too eager to fight. They desperately wanted to liberate their capital themselves, to owe their freedom to nobody, not the Germans they were fighting, and certainly not the approaching Soviet Red Army.
Which proved tragic given the Soviet reaction.
And utterly tragic. The Red Army reached the outskirts of Warsaw right on the Vistula River and then just stopped. Stalin refused repeated Allied pleas to help the uprising, even denying landing rights for Allied planes trying to airdrop supplies.
Why? What do the sources suggest?
They suggest Stalin feared the fiercely independent, non-communist Polish Home Army almost as much as he feared the Nazis. He was quite content to let the Germans crush this potential post-war political rival for him before his own forces moved in. A brutally cynical calculation.
The German reprisals against the uprising were horrific.
Designed to utterly flatten the city as an example. SS and police units under Erich von dem Ochzalewski committed mass atrocities. Some 30,000 non-combatant civilians were slaughtered in the Old Town district alone during the fighting. The uprising lasted for 63 days, fought with incredible courage, but ended in total devastation and the city's near-complete destruction.
And that quote from the Red Army soldier captures the terrible complexity.
Yes, observing the Poles after the Soviets finally entered the ruins. The Poles are strange. They fear us very much. No less than they fear the Germans. It sums up the tragic predicament of Poland, caught between two ruthless totalitarian powers.
Okay, fast forward to December 1944. Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. The Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes offensive.
Launched in utmost secrecy, achieving complete surprise. Allied generals had become dangerously complacent, believing the Germans lacked the fuel, the men, the morale for any major offensive. They thought the war in the West was nearly won.
But one Allied general reacted incredibly quickly. Patton.
Yes, George Patton. Even before the offensive began, he had his staff drawing up contingency plans, just in case. As soon as the scale of the German breakthrough became clear, he famously pivoted his entire Third Army 90 degrees, abandoning the grinding fight in Lorraine, what he called the manure-filled, waterlogged villages, and launched a powerful counterattack against the southern flank, the Bulge, relieving the besieged town of Bastogne. His rapid reaction was absolutely key to stabilizing the front.
The offensive also caused a major crisis in the Allied command structure.
It did. With the German advance cutting off communications between the northern and southern shoulders of the Bulge, Eisenhower made the controversial decision on December 20th to temporarily transfer command of the two American armies north of the salient, the 9th and the 1st, to Field Marshal Montgomery.
How did the American generals take that?
General Omar Bradley, whose 12th Army Group headquarters was south of the salient, felt it was a massive vote of no confidence in American leadership. He was furious and apparently threatened to resign. It caused significant friction.
And the conditions for the ordinary soldiers caught in the battle.
Terrible. Especially for the American troops initially overrun the Ardennes. Most were still wearing their summer uniforms, completely unequipped for the bitter winter weather. Frostbite and trench foot caused thousands of casualties, almost as many as enemy action in some units.
And again, the German advance, particularly the Waffen-SS spearheads, was marked by atrocities.
Yes. Infamously, SS troops under Jochen Peiper, part of the 1st SS Panzer Division, vented their frustration at the slowing advance by murdering American prisoners of war near Malmedy. They also killed numerous Belgian civilians. The sources mention 130 men, women, and children murdered in various massacres around towns like Stavlot.
The Bulge is eventually contained, and the final Soviet offensives begin in January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive.
Launched January 12th. It begins with Marshal Ivan Konev's shattering artillery bombardment, something like 300 guns packed into every kilometer of front line. He just pulverizes the German defenses.
And the German resistance collapses.
Crumbles almost immediately. The Soviet advance is incredibly rapid. German commanders in East Prussia are forced into a chaotic retreat, leading to horrific scenes of desperate German civilians, mostly women, children, old men fleeing westward in the brutal winter cold, trying to reach Baltic ports for evacuation ships. Often in vain. Hundreds of thousands died during that flight.
And the advance of the Red Army itself was marked by chaos and brutality.
Yes, the sources, including accounts by figures like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was an artillery officer there, describe widespread looting and destruction in East Prussia, soldiers becoming avid beasts, smashing property, seizing anything of value. And tragically, this was compounded by mass rape of German women on a truly horrific scale, seen by some Soviet soldiers perhaps as justified vengeance for German atrocities in Russia, but utterly brutal nonetheless.
The stage is set for the final act. The Battle for Berlin, April 1945, there was a race between Soviet commanders.
Absolutely. Stalin deliberately fostered rivalry between his top marshals, Zhukov and Konev. He wanted the glory of capturing Berlin for a Russian, specifically Zhukov, his favorite, and not for Rokossovsky, who was of Polish origin. So he pushed Zhukov forward aggressively towards Berlin from the east.
But Zhukov gets bogged down initially.
He does. At the heavily defended Seelow Heights, just east of Berlin. His initial frontal assaults fail with heavy losses. Zhukov apparently had a very tense phone call with Stalin, who immediately threatened to divert Konev's tank armies, which were advancing faster further south, northward, to take Berlin instead. That spurred Zhukov into finally breaking through the heights, but at enormous cost.
Konev's advance was faster.
Konev's armies raced forward south of Cottbus. In a daring move, his tanks crossed the Spree River without even waiting for bridging equipment. The water apparently came just above the tracks. They pushed on rapidly and reached the main road leading to the German Army High Command headquarters at Zossen, south of Berlin, effectively starting the encirclement of the capital from the south.
And Hitler, down in his bunker, is still delusional.
Completely detached from reality, issuing orders to non-existent armies. His final fantasy was ordering General Wenck's tiny 12th Army, which was actually facing the Americans on the Elbow River, to somehow turn around, break through the Red Army, and relieve Berlin. An impossible task. He also made it clear he believed the civilian population of Berlin should perish with him, share his fate. Refused any organized evacuation.
After Hitler commits suicide on April 30th, Goebbels tries to negotiate.
Joseph Goebbels, now chancellor for about a day, tries to open negotiations for a truce with the Soviets. Stalin contemptuously refuses anything less than unconditional surrender. He reportedly ordered Zhukov to tell the Germans that if they didn't surrender immediately, Berlin would be blasted into ruins.
Goebbels' end.
On May 1st, Goebbels and his wife Magda committed suicide in the Chancellery Garden. Magda had first poisoned their 6 young children in the bunker. Their bodies were then partially incinerated with petrol, following Hitler's example. The final grotesque Götterdämmerung of the Nazi regime.
While Berlin falls, the war is still raging in the Pacific. Okinawa.
Yes, the last major battle. The American landing on Okinawa on April 1st, 1945, was initially described as an anticlimax after the unbelievable horrors of Iwo Jima. Very little opposition on the beaches. But that was deceptive.
Why?
Because the Japanese commander, General Ushijima, had deliberately conceded the beaches. He planned to pull the Americans inland, into the heavily populated southern part of the island where he had prepared incredibly strong, deep defensive positions, caves, tunnels, forcing the Americans into brutal close-quarters attritional warfare, which is exactly what happened. Okinawa was incredibly bloody.
Which leads directly to the decision to use the atomic bombs.
Yes. Faced with the prospect of invading the Japanese home islands, an invasion projected to cost perhaps 1 million Allied casualties and many millions of Japanese lives, President Truman made the decision. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, chosen partly to demonstrate the terrifying power of the new weapon and shock Japan's leadership into surrender, thereby avoiding the horrors of that invasion.
And the Emperor's broadcast finally ends it.
August 15th. Emperor Hirohito's broadcast to the Japanese people the first time most had ever heard his voice, announcing the surrender. Tellingly, he phrased it obliquely, saying the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The sources describe officers and soldiers across Asia listening on their knees, bowing towards the radio, toward the voice of their divine emperor. The Second World War was finally over.
We've covered an immense amount of ground there, moving incredibly fast, but hopefully thoroughly, through that whole complex timeline. From, the localized atrocities kicking things off in China, the blitzkrieg, the industrialized slaughter in Europe's death camps, right through to that final, awful nuclear punctuation mark in the Pacific.
And the legacy, as the sources make clear, is just as complex. Yes, the victory defeated fascism, but it conspicuously failed to deliver lasting world peace, didn't it? It led almost immediately into new conflicts. Latent civil wars erupting, the Cold War settling in, anti-colonial struggles breaking out across the globe, the end of one conflict sowing the seeds for many more.
Which brings us, I think, to the ultimate paradox highlighted in the material we've looked at. The victory over Nazi Germany seemed to require the strategic political sacrifice of one half of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, into what the sources grimly call the Stalinist maw, in order to save the other half.
A deeply uncomfortable truth.
It really is. So the final question we leave you with is this. When we evaluate World War II, often called the Good War, can we ever fully reconcile that necessary victory over fascism with the simultaneous necessary sacrifice, essentially, of many of our allies to another totalitarian power? How do we weigh wartime necessity against the post-war political reality? It's a heavy question, perhaps unanswerable, but one that profoundly shapes the world we still live in today.